Coming to you direct from the nerve center of the galaxy's greatest comic. This is the 2000 AD thrillcast.
Borak Thung, Earthlets, and welcome to the second of the lockdown tapes with the 2000 AD thrillcast. I'm your host, Mulchar. I really hope you enjoyed the last episode with the interview with Mike Dorey. Absolutely fantastic, Jen. Do check it out if you have missed it. This is the second episode of this week, and we have three Zarjaz guests for you. We've got Ram V, who's a writer on the new Action 2020 special. He's penned the Kids Rule OK revival. And we've got Dan Lish, who's the artist on Hookjaw. Now, if you don't know what Action is, it was the predecessor of 2000 AD, a highly controversial comic which was effectively banned, neutered by moral outrage, the four-penny nightmare as it was branded. Now, the 2020 special might not necessarily get the same reaction as the original did, but it's out now from all good newsagents and comic book stores. Those that are open, because everything is now obviously in lockdown, go along to 2000ad.com/news and you'll find an article about our reaction and our plans for this unprecedented period of, problems for us all. And we appreciate that everybody is doing their best, or hopefully they are, to mitigate all the problems with the COVID-19 pandemic. Make sure that you are staying safe, washing your hands, looking after those most vulnerable in your communities. 2000 AD will continue to be published along with the Judge Dredd magazine. So go along to the website to find out what our plans are over the next few weeks. On this episode, obviously, we're talking to Dan and to Ram. We've also got Graham Mason, who is a video games journalist. Now, the other week we had Dan Abnett, we had Chris Roberson, and we had Tim Jones on talking about comic books that became video games and video games that became comics. I'd wanted to get Graham on for that episode, but unfortunately technical difficulties made it impossible. But he's gone on to talk about the 8-bit revolution in the 1980s, where there were numerous 2000 AD games, some more successful than others. If anybody who had a ZX Spectrum or a Sinclair or any of those other fantastic, iconic, consoles, computers, whatever you want to call them, wasn't my bag at the time, unfortunately. I was too busy reading comics. Quite a few 2000 AD games were made at the time. So we had a chat on Skype about the successes and the misses of those particular titles. Absolutely fascinating. It's a nice kind of follow-up to that episode from the other week, so I hope you enjoy that as well. So make sure you go along to 2000ad.com and find out about all the Zarjaz comics we are publishing that are still available for you to order from our web shop. Again, apologies for the quality of the sound on this podcast and of the video, doing everything out of a cupboard. I always wanted to be Andy Crane in the broom cupboard on John's BBC. Never realised I'd get my chance in these circumstances. Anyway, let's crack on and have a chat to Ram V and to Dan Lish about the Action 2020 special. So it's fantastic to welcome onto the podcast Dan Lish.
Hello.
And Ram V.
Hello.
So we're talking about the Action 2020 special, but guys, do you want to introduce yourselves to the 2000 AD audience? Because this is really the first time that they'll have encountered your work in the pages. It's not 2000 AD, it's Action. First time they've encountered you in the pages of Action. So Dan, do you want to kick off by talking a little bit about the work you've done previously?
Wow. Let me see where I've sort of dipped in and out of lots of illustration jobs, and it's hard to sort of quantify the amount of stuff. But I've dipped in and out of comics, out of toy design, computer concept art, video game concept art, and music album covers, murals, graffiti art. I mean, there's a lot. So my first comic, I would say official comic pages that were published, which I suppose is looking back is quite prestigious really, but it was in heavy metal in about 2001. Before that, these pages that were based on my childhood were for the Fridge magazine. It was like a snowboard sort of hip hop magazine in New York because I lived in New York at the time. And so I sent those off to heavy metal and they accepted them and stuck them in heavy metal. Actually, that reminds me, I did win a 2000 AD competition when I was about 11 years old. I put Strontium Dog's outfit on a dog. And I did win Artist of the Year and I got 10 cops video and 10 quid that my stepmom gave me a bollocking for because I spent them on tapes, music cassette tapes, and I didn't put the tenner in the bank. So that's my official printed comic scenario. I mean, I've how long do you want me to waffle on for? Because it's quite...
however long you want to, we're captive audience.
Well, I mean, I did do a book that was a novel that my friend Dan Willett wrote. I illustrated it, called Cardigan, not Cardigan, Cardigan, and that we actually started that in 2007. I ended it in 2011. This is book one, and it got published by Achilles Publishing in France. We're still working on book two because he's a very busy man who works in the toy industry, manufacturing vinyl toys. Really, really cool bespoke vinyl toys. He's very busy, and we haven't really got round to finishing off book two. For now, I'm more known for my ego strip illustration project that is all hip hop, funk, soul, jazz based, 90% hip hop, that started on the train up to my job as a concept artist in London for a video game. God, sorry, I'm really sorry. You opened up a can of worms. The journey continues. That's all I'm saying.
I'll let you off the hook with that. Ram, what about you? When did you start working in comics?
I've got a much shorter history. I self-published my first comic in 2016. There's a book called Black Mamba that I put together while I was studying creative writing here. Obviously, I was writing it and I put it together with a bunch of artists that I knew from back in India. And we self-published that at the end of 2016. 2017, following that, I did an image book called Paradiso. And then that did quite well. It opened up a few doors for me. 2018, I did a short story on DC's Batman Secret Files. And then following that, I've done more work. I've done Catwoman. I'm the current writer on Justice League Dark. I've got other stuff from Image and Vault, and I've been making comics since then.
Right.
So
excellent.
And now the 2080 action special.
Brilliant. Well, I'm going to stick with you, Ram, because I want to talk about the strip that you've written, which is Kids Rule OK, which was probably one of the most controversial strips in an already controversial comic book, just because of the brand of violence that it was showing, and it was a Kids Rule OK cover, which helped begin this moralist backlash in the 1970s. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your take on Kids Rule OK?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was actually one of the sort of biggest considerations that went into my take on it, is because, I mean, it was hyper violent. It was anarchist in its message, and the art portrayed the story in a way that was, I mean, obviously sensational for its time. But I mean, look at where we live now, right? I mean, I can put on most Netflix shows, and see twice that level of violence every 10 seconds. So I guess what is sensational is probably to take that level of hyper-violence and conflict and maybe say, okay, I'm going to try and do something hopeful with it, rather than sort of bemoan the crashing down of society around us. I'm going to go, okay, well, all that's happened. The world's done terribly. People are killing each other. But even within that, there is room for hope. There is perhaps a way to start building something new. And that really is the take for that short story. I pitched that, and the second thing that kind of went into it is, growing up in India, I didn't really have access to a lot of 2000 AD stuff. I mean, I didn't have access to Marvel DC either. So when I came onto this project, I was talking to my editors, and I said, you guys know, like, I have zero history with this, so anything you're going to ask me to pitch is going to be completely new. And they said, that's what we want. We want new ideas. We want new stories. And that was really cool. So I was like, okay, well, how do I really make this new and my own? And I mean, I think coming from that sort of a background, I wanted to do something hopeful.
It's interesting what you say about the kind of thing that Kids Rule OK was doing in the 1970s is 10 a penny now. Is kind of, you know, it's dystopia, post-apocalyptic. How have you tried to bring a little bit of that kind of sense of anarchism, that sense of chaos from the original into the one that you've done? I mean, have you read the
Yeah, I did.
So, yeah.
They gave me a bunch of PDFs to read, so I read all of them, and I said, I think the first decision I kind of made was said that, okay, well, I'm not going to just, because that was, I think it was based in like 1983, if I'm not mistaken, and clearly that didn't. But I said, okay, well, what's the logical progression? If this is based in 2020, then what's the logical progression if that was the case in 1983? And so now we're looking at 2020, which is a society that has progressed for, you know, whatever, 60 years, and has gotten to where it is right now. So I have not only taken that aesthetic, I've extrapolated it over half a century to get it to this point. And so we are well and truly into the dystopia now. And I mean, I guess in an interesting way, maybe the story is kind of letting go of the baggage that it had and is now looking forward. It's a society that's kind of letting go of the baggage that it had and is now looking forward, even though it is entirely violent and bloody and fighting all the time.
Obviously, you can't have, well, I hope you can't have predicted just how timely the strip would be, considering, you know, I'm now sat in a wardrobe and we're both self-isolating at home.
I mean, it does, not to spoil things, but the first page does say, we must have rules. We are not savages after all. They read in a book somewhere, but that was before the old withered and died. So I was like, okay, maybe a little bit too prescient. I don't know.
Wait, one thing I wanted to explore was Kids Rule OK came out in 1976, which was a time of real great social upheaval in the UK, as you know, you were beginning to move towards the Conservative government that dominated the very late 70s and into the 80s. There's a lot of civil unrest with the miners' strikes and things like that. How do you feel this strip relates to how we are now in a way that strip related to how we were then?
I mean, I really, one of the things I try to do is I try to make comics relatable for people across cultures. Like, personally, being from India, I grew up in India until I was 18, 19, but I read British comics, I read American comics, I read European comics, and they all still connected with me. So, I mean, this is set so far in the future where potentially ideas of nation states have dissolved into, we just kind of live here, and whoever beats up the most number of people in this little group wins. And that kind of might is right, and that kind of, this is mine now, and you guys are unwelcome, and you guys, I will throw you out because I'm the bully in the area. That ideology, even though it's not so obvious, is still an undercurrent in the politics that we see today. So for anyone who's a citizen of the world and who has attempted to try and share the places that they live in and the resources that they have, to suddenly be confronted with, people in power saying that, no, this doesn't belong to you now, this is ours, and we decide if you are worthy of getting it, whether that's immigration policy, whether that's a nation state versus a collection of states, if you will. We see the undercurrent of that ideology rise up over and over throughout history, and so I think we are there again. And maybe the best thing to do there is tell people who are affected by it that, no, we can still build something new. We don't have to sort of recede and fall back into those old patterns over and over again.
As I referenced earlier, Kids Will Okay was marked out by the shocking nature of the violence, particularly for comic books at the time. It's one of the things that made action such a groundbreaking comic. But in a world where, I mean, you can get comics on pretty much any level of violence that you want now. In a world where something like, for example, Crossed exists, how do you still shock with violence? Can you still shock with violence?
No, but I think you can shock with the motivation and the consequences behind violence. I mean, sure, you can like you said, I can throw on pretty much any form of media out there and find all degrees of violence on it, but I still think that there is a point to be made. There are stories to be told through the motivations behind these. So where one form of violence was a reaction to an authoritarianism or a reaction to the sort of classist differences that existed in its time, this kind of violence that we see now is more protectionary. It's about protecting what you believe is yours, and I suppose that's one way in which I'm changing readers' perceptions of what that comic meant and what the violence in that comic meant.
You've only got a few pages to play with in this special because it has to be one and done. And you talked about trying to foster a sense of hope. How did you find? And this is a question I ask an awful lot, particularly of people who've worked in American style comics and then come to 2000 AD. How did you find that kind of sense of hyper compression?
I mean, to be honest, I've tried not to hyper compress it. I've tried to make my point through a vignette rather than try to fit in backstory and character and drama and where it's going. So what you're really looking at is a moment within a larger story. But I guess the trick of being a good writer is to make that moment somehow reflect on the narrative as a whole. So most good vignettes do that. I mean, Gaiman, Moore, they were famous for being able to do that, is pick a small, tiny crux of a moment, and you realize that is a fractal representation of the entire narrative. So I guess even though it's a 10-page comic, it does put across what I'm trying to say, about hope and about rebuilding.
Sure. Lovely. I'm going to come on to Dan now because Dan, you've illustrated Hookjaw, which is a huge favourite amongst people who either read or really like comic books from the 1970s and 80s. Everyone always brings up the fact it was intended as a kind of, not a rip-off, but a riff on Jaws and things like that. But I always felt it took a step further than that. It was Jaws, to a certain extent, was quite sinister. scary. Whereas Hookjaw was so much more visceral. There was so much more blood and guts, and you saw everything that they couldn't possibly show on the screen. Tell me a little bit about your approach to drawing this kind of level of gore, and if you did pay tribute to the original.
Well, to be honest, I wasn't aware, maybe because of my age, but I wasn't aware of it from back then. So Keith from 2000 AD. Can you hear me okay still?
Yeah, fine. So
Yeah,
I just muted Ram because there's just a bit of background noise.
Yeah, okay. So he sent me the script, and I didn't really know too much about it, and it was a bit of a cult sort of thing in England. It was quite sort of, had a good spirit of rebellion about it, and again around that time there was, as you were saying earlier, there was a lot of unrest in the country, and that sort of gave a nice big middle finger up to Thatcher's Britain at the time, I think. But that was cool with me. That sort of resonated with me quite well. I thought, well, I'm just going to have to do the best that I can with it, and it just took me back to the story that I was mentioning earlier, the cardigan thing, because I don't naturally gravitate towards violent, really gory things, these subject matters. I could quite happily stay away from it, but it really made me. You really have to get into that mind state, not research what intestines look like coming out of an old sailor's belly or something, but it's like I really had to go there, and a lot of it I made up because with the biology of it and the physics, and it's sort of, okay, well, I'm going to make this just look cool and dynamic. And sometimes you can get a bit too, well, is this physically correct? And I try not to get too caught up in that, and just try and have fun with it, and do it in my sort of quite laboured style of trillions of bloody lines per panel. So hopefully it sets the tone, and I can tip my cap to something that was very special back then, but quite honestly, maybe because of my age, I wasn't aware of it. I was a proper 2000 AD head from the age of, I'd say, 9 years old onwards. So that was just off my radar. So it was just a nice, pleasant surprise, and I had a lot of fun with it. But occasionally I was like, oh God, I've got to do this panel. It's horrible. It's horrible. And then my daughters would look over my shoulder, and I'd just hear like that as they wandered off. So it was challenging.
Because you do have, you describe it as laboured, but I describe it as detailed. Lots of cross hatching, lots of lines. Tell us a little bit about how you evolved that style, and was there anything you changed for this strip?
No, there was no change. I just went for it, and I create very loose thumbnails next to the script. I print the script out, and honestly, I've done it in so many strange places, illustrating this now that I'm working out my bedroom. So, I won't go into detail, but a lot of it was beside a swimming pool for my daughter's swimming training, and then gymnastics, and then in a pub waiting for her to finish gymnastics. I was all over the place, in the back garden if it was warm enough. So loose thumbnails, and then I would just rough out the rough panels in pencil, very loose. If you saw it, you think, well, what the hell is that? But it made sense to me, and then I would just go in and ink it. So it was quite, not spontaneous, because I made sure I had good reference. But I don't do tight plannings out. So sometimes it works, and because I didn't have the classic whiteout, I would do little touches editorially, post-product in Photoshop. So sometimes there's little bits that I wasn't happy about, because I really sort of got in there, and so I'm exploring it as it's happening, So a lot of it is not freestyle, but it's almost there, and I'm trying to keep to obviously what's written in the script. I did actually add a couple of extra panels to make it flow a bit better, and no one had a problem with that. So that freedom was very liberating as well, just to do what I wanted to do, you know.
I'm always interested by this process of thumbnailing, because I see artists mention it quite a bit on Twitter, where they will do like a little layout sketch, and they'll put something in there that in of itself, like you say, means nothing to anybody, but to you evokes something very specific. You know, this is what I want to do here, so I'm just going to put this little aid memoir here. And it's such an intensely personal process, that I think, because I mean, I don't know how you feel about this. Is it you I don't know, feeling your way through the script?
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. But also, it all starts in your noggin, and you're just that conduit for that creativity to come in. So all you really need to do, for me personally, because it's quite subjective, but is I make here's very, very rough gestures, but because it's in here, it's sort of like a very simplified shorthand. So then I can go back to it even like a month later, and it still makes sense, because you've sort of taken whatever's in your mind, a snapshot of it. So it still retains in here, even though I've done a little squiggle. Does that answer your question? I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean that usually happens even with the music stuff that I do. It's very loose, rough, and I'm very conscious of the client thinking, what the hell is this? And I need a tighter rough. Sometimes that happens. It's a bit of a ball ache, because it takes the real spontaneous juice out of it sometimes. You know, the fun. I'm in love with the process, you know.
One thing, before I ask this question, it's very important that anybody listening or watching this, this is a spoiler. If you have not read the Action 2020 special, do not proceed. Go and read it. Come back and we'll talk. Now, just give them. There you go. They've gone off to buy their copy. So your strip is actually Hookjaw versus Shako, the only bear on the CIA's death list, which, you know, it's just one of those characters with it out of all proportion to his time in comics, is still one of the most popular characters. I love him. I've always wanted to see him revived, and so to get Hookjaw and Shako into the same comic is fantastic. I mean, what was your reaction when you read the script?
Well, like I say, I wasn't bloody familiar with it, was I? I sound like a complete turnip, because you're gushing over it. Oh, I'm sorry, I just didn't know. And then I was sent a couple of albums, you know, of the greatest kills, so to speak, and that was pretty cool. It wasn't the best bedtime reading, but it was like, you know, just before you hit them and you got all these images in your head. But yeah, I'm sorry to disappoint it. I was really coming from, wow, I don't really know what I'm doing here. I'm just going to go for it, do what I do, and hopefully the fans will like it and I won't get too many complaints.
One of the key elements of that strip is that it doesn't have any words. There's no speech bubbles. Right. Did you feel any? I mean, I know storytelling is such a key element of what comic book artists do anyway. But did you feel any additional pressure because there wasn't going to be those little bubbles everywhere explaining?
No, if anything, it freed me up.
Oh, really? Oh, of course. You got more space.
Just shut the hell up and just keep, you know, and that's it. It's great because you got more space to play with. I even put sound effects in, and he said, no, take those out. We don't want any of those either. So I really enjoy drawing the sound effects and making them up. I mean, I should have known he didn't put them in a script, so you don't put them in. But I went there, and he said, no, take them back out. So, yeah, no, it was really nice, and I've got no problem with it.
Good. One thing I did want to ask about is a lot of artists have problems with animals. They can draw tanks, they can draw, you know, robots from the future, they can draw people. Some of them can anyway. How did you find two different types of animals?
No, that was fine. That was fine. I'd rather draw a bear than a tank any day. If I had to do robots, I mean, I'm probably just, you know, cutting my employment by 50%, but it would just bore the piss out of me. It really would. I don't know, a little quirky, more organic type robot, but I'm a lot more. I feel a lot more at ease with organic living things. I could do, robots are cool, but just a little tickle here and there. But bears and sharks, cool. I mean, trying to get the emotion, that's another thing. Because these two creatures, they've both got very small, beady little black eyes, and you're trying to, so I had to make the sort of frown a bit pronounced and a bit of a, and then with the shark, obviously I can't remember if I put a frown on the shark, but that was tough. But I think because of Jaws and me cacking my pants when I first saw that, I was just scared out of my life, and that helped because you got this sort of blank, pit blackness of the eye, and that's all you need, and just the teeth, and it's just so scary, isn't it? Just that massive gaping hole. And so with the bear, I could put a little bit more character in his face, but not too much where it just looks like a bear off of Ren and Stimpy or something. So it's a fine balance. But that was interesting, trying to get a bit of emotion in there and tension. So it's that was a challenge, but good challenge. I loved it.
I'm going to come back to. I'm going to try and come back to Ram. It won't let me unmute you. Come on. Why won't it? Hang on.
Does that work?
Oh, there we go.
I think I have to unmute it.
Yeah. God, that was a bit of a panic just then. I wanted to go back to you because we've been talking with Dan about artwork on Hookjaw, but on Kids Will Okay, you've got Henrik Stahlstrom.
Yeah,
who's we've had him on a few specials now. What was your feeling on his artwork?
I mean, I think it had that pre-built kind of post-apocalyptic sensibility about it. So when I looked at his artwork to begin with, these massive heavy blacks and really kind of bold lines and kind of angular art almost, and so. I think it fits, without giving too much away. I think it fits the general atmosphere of what we tried to do with the strip. So, and it also has that sort of very inky, gritty sensibility about it. So I thought it was a great fit. When I looked at the art, I was like, oh, don't have to even look at it. I know it's gonna look great. So.
I know a lot in American comics that there tends to be a lot more involvement of an editor in the different stages, and there's things like lettering passes and things like that. But at 2000 AD, we tend to not trust our creators more, but kind of just let them get on with it. Was it how much did you see of the process, or was it a bit of a surprise when everything came in?
I mean, to be honest. We had a bit of a stumble in the beginning.
All right. Okay. All right.
And I was originally told that it's going to be 10 to 12 pages. Go ahead and do it. And I was like, all right, fine. I'll take all 12 pages. And I'm also one of those guys who doesn't particularly like to do like 3-panel pages or 4-panel pages. So I'm like, all right, I'm going to fill these up. 6 panels, 7, 5. And then they were like, yeah, so that 12-page thing, we really meant 10. I was like, oh no! I have to now find a way to condense 20% of the script. But we did it. We did it, and I think it works, especially because of what you said earlier. Is because there is that sense of compression about the the 2080 action rules kind of action special comics. So I think we found like a happy medium between my level of compression and the level of compression that the comics had historically had. So it worked out all right. And then, yeah, obviously, once I turned the script in, I was also in a relatively sort of busy space of time. So I really must apologize to my editors for this. Keith, Oliver, sorry. So I just kind of went away and I was like, okay, cool, hit me when you have pages. And then once they were done, I looked at them and was like, yeah, perfect. I don't have to do anything here.
Right. One thing we were just talking to Dan about character and getting character into animals, because we haven't talked about your characters in your strip, and I come back to the whole thing of it may not necessarily be hyper compressed, but it's certainly, as you say, quite a short story. How did you find kind of forming these characters quickly, getting the audience's sympathy, getting to understand the world as quickly as possible?
I mean, I think we did some pretty. I mean, not to say it was just me. Obviously, the art plays a huge role in it. But I think we made some clever choices as a team in terms of character design and the kind of characters that we were using. So it was obviously I mean, again, without spoiling too much, there's groups involved, and each group dresses a certain way, and they call each other certain names, and so within small things like that, you transmit what the world is like, because these are culturally familiar things. You go like, oh, this is how they address each other. Like, there's a group of people who all have the same name for each other, so they all keep calling each other Mr. Builder. And so once you've done that, you don't really need to explain much behind that part of the world, because people get it. And I think we made a lot of interesting design choices that way. I've got a character in there that I really like called Leatherhead, who, like, when I first used him, Oliver came back to me and went, is this going to feel like a reference to a property that has already existed that we will not name here? And I went, like, to be honest, I didn't even know this character existed in other pop culture. I named him off of a little town outside of Surrey called Leatherhead. So, and so they were like, yeah, fine, that makes perfect sense. So,
brilliant. I mean, one thing I did want to ask about is, because as you said, neither of you really got a connection with the original action, is what your feelings are, and I'll come to you first, Dan. What your feelings are about revisiting these older comics? Obviously, Rebellion has this huge archive, all these hugely influential comics like Action. What do you think is the value in going back and revisiting, for want of a better phrase, rebooting strips like this?
Well, I felt a little bit uncomfortable about just not making these characters up again. But I mean, obviously, that I'd have my little take on them. But I went back to the original source to see what little quirks. I can't remember the original artist, but what he did, and I know there was one I favoured over the other. So I looked at the way the hook spike came through straight, like it was lodged in his bottom jaw, and came out, and it stayed there. So I like that. So I kept that one and scarred him up a little bit more. But I think I'm a bit of a stickler for, getting the facts right. It's a balance, isn't it? You don't want to get too anal about it, but I think it's quite important, especially from the hardcore fan base, that I tried hard to keep that flavour in check. But like I said, I was pretty unfamiliar about it, but I didn't let that worry me.
But Hookjaw is one of those characters that actually sort of cycled through quite a few creators. You had Ken Armstrong. Ken Armstrong was the writer with Pat Mills. You had Ramon Sola, Felix Carrion, and Eric Bradbury. Particularly, I don't know Carrion's work, but Sola and Bradbury, two absolute titans of the time, but always with their slight quirks and differences with the way they would do things, didn't they?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I'm incredibly bad with names and remembering them, because I suffer from quite a huge slab of dyslexia. So I'm just really awful at names. So even if I remembered them then, they're not going to hang in there. Photographic memory, fine, but words and names not happening. So yeah, I saw some lovely artwork, and it was really nice and dynamic, and of that time and epoch as well. And yeah, there was one shark, one angle that I really liked, and I went with that. And you could probably tell me, unless they all stuck the hook out the bottom of the jaw. I don't think all of them were like that, were they?
I honestly can't remember.
I don't
to be
know.
honest with you.
Yeah. I went with that, and that looked cool. And thank God for Photoshop at the time, though, because a couple of panels I forgot the bloody hook. And can you stick that hook back in? So I think that's a bad thing about working remotely by the side of swimming pools and gymnastic arenas, and because the consistency does lack a little bit sometimes, because you're dealing with general public just shooting by you, and snotty children and big mums. And I forgot that hook on several occasions. So yeah.
Well, that's what editors are for.
yeah.
Ram, I want to come to you and ask you the same question about the value of returning to all characters and old series. What's your take on it?
Well, I think it's a double-edged sword, to be honest. And I think as creators you have to be, especially, and I know on Dan's part this will ring true to him with the art as well, but especially as a writer going back to characters that have existed for a while, you don't want to just do it for nostalgia's sake, like, okay, here's a character that people loved 40, 50 years ago. You don't want to be writing a story that still only makes sense to people who loved it 40, 50 years ago. You want to be writing a story that someone who is a teenager or in their 20s today can pick up and go, oh, that's pretty fun. And so you really, as a creator, you have to, at least I try to be aware of that. I try to be aware that I'm writing for people who are reading comics today. And while you want to stay true to the spirit of the story and of the characters and what it was trying to do, you also want it to be inviting to people who have never read that before. And like I was someone like that. I always take my own example because I didn't read comics when they came out monthly on Wednesdays on paper racks and spinner racks. I got comics whenever a relative of mine would travel to the US or to the UK, and they'd bring back like a digest. That's what it was called. Bring back a digest of various comics that had come out, and I would read them. So I never got to read comics as they were coming out. But I could pick up, it was a day and age where you could pick up a random comic and read it and go like, oh yeah, I could just pick up the story and follow it from here. And I think that ethos is important even when you go back and pick up old characters. So I hate it when there are stories that go back and pick up these characters and you have to know like 20 years of comic book history to even realize why that character makes sense. I would much rather read stories where people pick up these old characters and have reinvented them, and later after you've read the story, when you go back and look at it, you go, oh, that's why this character talks like this, or that's why he walks like this, or that's why he keeps saying this word, because it makes sense now. So there's a way to do it invitingly, which I think is absolutely the right approach. And I think, having spoken to Keith and Oliver, I think that's what they're doing with this special, is they're taking these characters that have a long history and fandoms, but also opening them up to new readers who don't necessarily know what these characters were or they stood for back in the day.
I'd like to interject quickly. I think mine was set in the early 70s, so when it came to the pistol on the boat, what's it called? Someone help me out here.
Like the flare pistol.
The flare pistol.
Yeah.
I looked at those. I thought, well, let's get a bit nerdy, and I'll look at one from the late 60s. So it's been hanging around on the ship for about 4 or 5 years. And I went there, but usually, like you're saying, I would put my own take on it. But because it was set in a specific era, that helped with the dress sense. And although fishermen haven't really changed their fashion sense in dramatically since then. But yeah, sorry.
I wanted to round things out by talking about violence in comic books, which we've already kind of touched on, but it's interesting to see the reaction to comic books from people who perhaps call for comic books to still be like action was, violent. One of the joys of comic books in the 1970s and 1980s was that you didn't really want your parents to know that you were reading them because they were so nasty, they were so violent. But now, when those generations are the ones with kids, but they're producing comics, and Dan, you kind of mentioned this when talking about your kids. It can be a kind of oh no, I don't necessarily want my kids reading this. Do you think there's a real kind of issue of what we recognise as a formative experience for us once you become a parent? And Ram, I don't know if you've got kids or not. But, once you become a parent, all of a sudden your standards change a little bit, and you become that parent going, "Oh, I'm not sure if this is entirely appropriate." I mean, what's your take, Dan?
No, I just went for it. If my girls saw it, then I would explain to them, "Oh, this is nasty, isn't it? Oh," and then just make a sort of an inaudible sound and wander off. So, but I think they got used to it. I mean, I only had, I think it was 7 pages, and they were pretty horrific. But saying that, I didn't do it for gore's sake, although Keith said just make it really gory, like the kids would want to stick it up on their wall and piss the parents off. But I found it quite hard to really, for a start, when it came to the blood, I made the mistake of just making it all black. So when it came to colouring it, obviously I had to put more blood on it to make that red, with the black blood as well. So, but it's a weird thing. I think you just, it depends on the creator. If they edit themselves, then to the behest of the story. Does that make any sense? Did I just make that word up? Then that's up to them, isn't it? But me, I wanted to really go for it, but I was very limited and thinking, well, what the hell is going on in someone's guts here, and what does it look like when it comes out? I'll have to make that up. So I just tried to make it look pretty just awful. But it was, maybe I subconsciously was editing myself just to still make it look cool, instead of just going all over the place. And because he's still got to follow a narrative, and the shark has bitten him here, and his head's going off in that direction. So you've got to make it all relative. But I made so much of it up. I think if you get a doctor or a surgeon looking at this, if they're a fan of comics, they'll think, what the bloody hell has he done there? What's that sticking out of his shirt? That sounds dubious. I'll shut up now.
I mean, to be honest, like, I think people should just go for it. I think
that's what it's about. That's what his comics are about. It's rebellion.
I don't buy this. I don't buy this argument. Like, oh my God, video games are making people violent. No, if video games are making your kids violent, maybe it's a cause for better parenting, not better video games. And the same thing. I believe the same thing about comics. If your kids are finding their rebellion in comics, then maybe the cause for that is elsewhere, and rethink that. Because I read like the most ridiculous stuff growing up. I stole books from my father's library and read them when I wasn't supposed to. I had a group of friends who'd hang out behind my building and read dirty magazines in the garage. So I did all that stuff.
You find it's all over the place in England in the 70s and 80s. So it's like
and to be honest, like, kids from that era, their formative experiences are going to be very different from the formative experiences of kids today. Like, trust me, comic book violence is not a formative experience for kids today. And so I think we have to let kids be kids. We have to let both kids and their circumstances damage them a little, because, I mean, builds character, I would say. And I think I think we need to stop sort of pushing our responsibilities onto general media and then finding sort of places to blame. So bring on the gore, bring on the violence, all of it. Society will be fine. Least of our problems.
Well, I think on that note, it's the perfect point to wrap this up. Dan, where can people find you online if they want to seek out your work?
Oh God, put me on the spot. Instagram, I try to do that daily. At Dan Lish 1. Facebook, you can just find me on there. I can't remember the whatchamacallit thingy, majiggy. Yeah, you'll find me just Dan Lish, Lish, L instead of a F. All right, that's.
I mean, that would have been appropriate for Hookjaw.
Yeah, right.
Dan Fish minus the F plus the L.
Ram, what about you?
Yeah, you can find me at the right Ram on Twitter, which is where I'm most active. You can also find me on Instagram on Ram V Writes, where I'm less active. If you find me on Facebook, it'll just be stuff that you've already seen on Twitter or Instagram. Best place to talk to you about anything that's not work is probably the pub. So, yeah.
Well, fingers crossed we all get to go to the pub at some point in the future.
Yeah, if that ever happens, that might have to change. I might have to build you might have to build a social media website which is just the pub. Every time someone hits a like, you get a beer delivered to your place.
Oh God! Don't make me dream. Anyway, yes, thanks very much, guys. Really love the work in the action special. So yeah, looking forward to seeing the reactions from the readers. But thanks again for taking part.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Appreciate
All right. Well, huge thanks to Dan and to Ram for taking the time to chat. Really interesting what they've got to say about the Action 2020 special, particularly as they haven't necessarily got a connection to the original strips. It is a brilliant anthology that you really do need to pick up. And if you order a copy from the 2000 AD web shop, then you can get it with a replica of the banned issue, which was pulled due to the moral outrage about the content. I mean, it does say commit suicide on the front, so what are you going to do? So next up on the podcast, we have Graham Mason, a video games journalist who I wanted to get on before, like I said, but is here to talk about 8-bit video games from the 1980s and 2000 AD's attempts to capitalise on an industry that was really just beginning in the 80s and yet has come to dominate so much of geek culture and, as it turns out, to own 2000 AD. So it's great to welcome onto the podcast Graham Mason, who's a journalist who's written about 2000 AD video games. Hey, Graham, how you doing?
Hi, Mike. I'm fine. Thanks very much. Thanks for having me on.
No worries. It's a pleasure. So we had Dan Abnett and Chris Roberson and Tim Jones on the other week to talk about 2000 AD video games and 2000 AD comic books converted into video games and vice versa. But the history of 2000 AD video games goes back a lot further, well into the 1980s. In fact, I seem to recall not long after 2000 AD became a hit, people were already looking to develop early games based on their characters.
That's right. I think the properties made very good bedfellows. Obviously, a lot of Spectrum and Commodore 64 fans were probably early teenage boys. So that was obviously a large part of 2000 AD's readership as well. Certainly myself fell into that category. So I think it was only natural that once like the 8-bit computers became really popular in the mid-80s, maybe 83, 84, that people were going to look to license 2000 AD characters to make video games out of them.
Because if you talk about the kind of heyday, the first golden age of 2000 AD, you're talking about that kind of 1980 to 1984 period. So these two kind of, fandoms in a way, grew up next to each other, really, didn't they?
That's right, yeah. 2000 AD started in the late 70s. Computing did as well. And then when licensing became a big thing in the... when licensing became a big thing in the 80s, it was obvious that the two would merge in some form. And obviously, a lot of 2000 AD properties are quite violent as well. A lot of video games, even back then, were quite violent. So it was a match really that was a very obvious one, and I'm surprised actually it took as long as it did, which was in 1984 when a company called Quicksilver, which was one of the big early 8-bit publishers, released 2 games based on Strontium Dog.
Mm. I mean, that seems like if you set Dread aside, Strontium Dog seems like an obvious one, because it's essentially a Western, so you're basically going in and shooting lots of people. For those people who haven't played it, do you want to kind of, if you can, sum up what the experience of playing these games was like?
Well, there were 2 different games which were developed separately. The first game was released on the Commodore 64, and it was specifically developed by Quicksilver themselves, and it was called Strontium Dog and the Death Gauntlet. And like you've already said, it had a very strong Western theme to it, where Johnny Alpha is basically hunting down the Styx brothers, presumably his targets in the game, and he has to collect the bounty on these and rescue Wolf and Gronk at the end of the game as well. That's kind of another theme going through it. And yeah, there's a very throughout it really a very strong Western theme, where he's traveling across this brown landscape, which was particularly common on the Commodore 64, basically shooting the bad guys as he went along. So it was a very basic game, not a lot to it. And if you looked at it, apart from the title screen, which obviously had the name of the character, you probably wouldn't even know it was a Strontium Dog or 2000 AD license. Mm-hmm. So they didn't really, I'd say, portray the character particularly well, but obviously the themes were there, and they did the best they could with the technology. And then separately, another coder, a bedroom coder, sent in an adaptation of a Strontium Dog strip that he particularly liked, called The Killing, which is one of the most popular Strontium Dog strips and one of my favourites.
Yeah. And
he'd adapted this into a maze-type game for the ZX Spectrum. And whilst it bore a little bit more similarity to the character, again, you could be playing any game, really. It just happened to have... Both of them had really nice... official 2000 AD covers, Strontium Dog covers, and that kind of sold it. And then the game afterwards was a bit of an afterthought. But obviously, these were the first efforts into actually portraying 2000 AD characters. And as such, you know, if you were in your teens, early teens, and you wanted to play a bit of 2000 AD on your Spectrum and Commodore 64, these were good things to play.
As you say, this was kind of the dawn of video games. What were the challenges for people developing these games? Not just in terms of tying things into existing licenses, but also just the technical challenges for people. Because for those who, I mean, I don't know how many people who are listening to this don't know what a ZX Spectrum was. Because you're getting this off of a tape player, which is screaming effectively at your computer. Yeah. And you know, those things could take hours if they weren't playing right. What were the kind of challenges that these developers faced in translating comic books into games?
Well, the biggest thing they had to combat, of course, was the lack of memory, because most Spectrum and Commodore 64 games had less memory than your average email that does today. So it was very difficult for them to cram in all the necessary gameplay. So they used a lot of tricks, and there was basically a lot of repeating gameplay on all of these games. That they would be very similar. If you played them for too long, you'd realise that it's just basically the same thing over and over again. So you had to use really a lot of imagination in order to certainly invest yourself in these games in the first place. That's what we relied upon back then. We actually tried to make ourselves feel like we were Johnny Alpha, because the on-screen representation, I mean, the Commodore 64 had hardware support for graphics, but the Spectrum didn't. The coders had to make it all up themselves. They went straight to the metal usually and had to code it themselves. So it was an exhaustive approach to coding, and often it wasn't really translated particularly well onto the screen. But yeah, they didn't have a lot of tech to play with, unfortunately. Which so perhaps we shouldn't be too critical of what they created in the end.
Do you think the 2000 AD games, and we'll talk more about the kind of games that were developed. Do you think they were particularly good examples of these early steps of people trying to work out what was possible and what wasn't?
I think definitely in as far as the Commodore 64 game, the Death Gauntlet, was a scrolling shoot 'em up, basically, of which the Commodore 64 was particularly good at doing. It always had nice scrolling, the Commodore 64. I was a Spectrum fan myself, but it did have nice scrolling, and the sprites moved quite nicely, and it was very good at shoot 'em up. So that was particularly well suited to the Commodore 64. The Spectrum game was a flick screen adventure, which it was particularly more suited to. And it was quite colourful as well, and the sprites were more detailed. So yeah, each game had its plus points. But I think as early examples of 2000 AD licenses, that's what makes them notable really as games, I think.
Okay, so you got those two initial games that had mixed success with Strontium Dog. What were the kind of things that came next?
Well, next up was my favourite. My favourite 2000 AD comic strip has always been Rogue Trooper. I've always liked the desolation of like the battle in the war going on in a far-flung galaxy, and the two different factions, and also I think there's a very rich background to it with the Quartz Zone massacre, and basically Rogue is trying to avenge the massacre of all his genetic infantrymen who were massacred at this battle. So I think Rogue Trooper was always a good target, and I believe it was published by Piranha, this next game, and I believe the Judge Dredd license at the time was tied up. All sorts of things were going on. Might have been to do with the film that eventually appeared a few years later. So Rogue Trooper was the one that people were battling for next. And they produced on the ZX Spectrum, Amstrad and the Commodore 64 an isometric game, 3D isometric game, which was very popular, similar to Night Law, which had been a big success on the Spectrum. A lot of similar games were very popular. So it was an obvious choice to do a game in this style. And actually this was, I think, of all the 2000 AD 8-bit games, it was probably the one that evoked the comic strip best, because not only did it look like you were actually playing a 2000 AD game, the backdrops were very unique, obviously, to represent New Earth. And although they weren't particularly involved in the gameplay, you had Bagman and Gunner up in the top right-hand corner, chirping every now and then, comments which looked like they'd been ripped from the pages of 2000 AD. Everything was obviously written by someone who knew the strip particularly well and had read it quite a lot. And I think if you're going to play a 2000 AD game from the 80s, this is probably the one that you'll play and look at and think, yeah, this feels like the 2000 AD universe. It really was. I think even this was the third game from 2000 AD. It really was the one that sort of set the standard.
Forgive my ignorance, because I wasn't a gamer then, and I'm not that much of a gamer now. What does isometric mean?
It means that you've kind of got a force perspective, so the characters are presented in kind of a semi 3D view. If you think of a modern example, would be something like Farmville, something like that. It's where so basically the characters can still walk behind walls and behind each other. Okay. And there's like several different planes of the game rather than just the simple 2D games like the Death Gauntlet, where you're only seeing it in one dimension. So it opened up quite a lot of gameplay having this different type of view, and I think Rogue Trooper really took advantage of that.
Do you think there's a particularly, and I kind of already know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, why Rogue Trooper has actually, in terms of 2000 AD games, been the most popular character, the one that's had the most success in terms of games? Because you've not just got the ones from the 1980s, but also obviously Rebellion did Rogue Trooper,
very good game,
in the 2000s. So do you think Is it just that Rogue Trooper is the kind of story, the kind of action, the kind of character that just naturally lends itself to a computer game world?
Yes, because he's got a great premise behind him in that he's just looking for revenge and to find out the truth about what happened. And also, I think because you're unlike games such as Strontium Dog, where you've got other characters, or Judge Dredd, where you've got like this whole universe. I think Rogue Trooper is a very singular story. It's about one character and his journey, and how he goes about that journey and taking revenge on the people that have wronged him. And I think that does narrow down its focus a lot, which is particularly well suited to a video game where, of course, it's usually just one person playing it.
Okay, so you've got I'm getting a bit of echo there. You got the Rogue Trooper game. You've got Strontium Dog. There was reading the stuff that you've written about this. There was the games that were advertised by Piranha, where they advertised 3. One was Rogue, one was Dread, and the other was Halo Jones. But only one of those came to fruition, which was the Rogue Trooper game. Do you have any bead on why they only had a 1 out of 3 hit on those?
Piranha was a imprint of Macmillan Publishing, which is I don't know if they're still about, a big publishing company.
Yeah.
And Rogue Trooper was published in 1986, and basically, even though this was still quite early in the time of the 8-bits, it was a very tumultuous time. A lot of companies were going under. Licensed games were becoming more and more popular, which obviously involves a lot bigger investment. So the days of companies like Quicksilver and Bugbyte were fast coming to an end, and there was a lot of change going on. And basically, Piranha, it released quite a few licensed games, quite a few original games as well. And then one day, Macmillan just pulled the plug. So they were busy working on, I think it was Judge Death they were working on, and Halo Jones. And actually, Halo Jones was completed. And the day that Piranha was wound up, the coder turned up at Piranha with the completed tapes, with the gold masters, I suppose you call them these days. And they said, no, you can't do anything with it. Just give it to us, and that's the end of it. And no one was able to release it, presumably because of licensing reasons. And that was the end of poor Halo Jones, unfortunately. And it's a real shame, because by the looks of it, from what we've been able to see on the internet now, it looks like it would have been a really decent game, a sort of like arcade adventure type game with quite a lot of depth to it. So that was the end of that, and that was the end of, unfortunately, Judge Death as well. And Judge Death was looking like it was going to be a first-person shooter, which was quite unusual for back then, because the technology generally struggled with that. And I think that was probably the reason why that got canned, because they were really struggling with making that work on the Commodore 64, which was going to be its platform.
I mean, I'm intrigued by this Halo game that we've never really been able to see it, and that it was a kind of action game, because of all the strips in 2000 AD that aren't necessarily action strips. Though the strip does have action in it. Halo Jones is one of those ones where you kind of go, doesn't necessarily lend itself to that kind of action, shoot 'em up kind of action thing.
No, not at all. And I think what they were doing with it, and what they did actually, as I say, it just wasn't released, was really, really interesting. And back in the 80s as well, it was really uncommon to have a strong female central character. Which I think also made the game really interesting. Maybe that's what attracted Piranha to it, was the fact that they could have a strong female protagonist instead of the usual muscly men in control of the game. So yeah, it would have been an interesting game, and it would have been something different, but unfortunately it wasn't to be.
So things, as you say, moving very rapidly, lots of companies going in and out of business. What did this mean for 2000 AD games after Piranha had been wound up?
Well, around the same time, there was another company called Martech, which was based in Pevensey Bay, and they were again, not a huge company, but they'd managed to weather the storm and were producing quite a few good licensed games. Probably their most famous game is Sam Fox Strip Poker, which, as you can imagine, caused quite a stir back in the 80s. So yeah, the guy that ran Martech, David Martin, I've interviewed him a couple of times, and he's a nice guy. And they basically they got this niche of licensing characters. He did a game based on Eddie Kidd's Jump Challenge, where you obviously had to get on a motorbike and jump over a load of buses. And another one called Brian Jacks Superstar. Brian Jacks was like a I don't know what you call, I suppose karate and judo expert back in the 80s. And anyway, they thought it would be a good idea to license 2000 AD games, license 2000 AD characters as well. And they had a studio called Creative Reality, which was 3 guys called Jazz Austin. I can't remember the other guy's name. Dave Dew was the graphics artist, I remember. And basically, Jazz Austin, who still codes games today, he's a huge 2000 AD fan. So much so, when I went to interview him once for Retro Gamer, we spent about half an hour talking about 2000 AD in the middle of talking about all these video games. So, and David Martin essentially said to Jazz, what are the best 2000 AD strips? And most people would probably expect him to say Judge Dredd, but Jazz is actually a huge fan of Nemesis the Warlock and Slain. And he said, I want to do games based on these 2 characters. So that's what he proposed. Martech kind of left him and his team to it. And they duly produced 2 games, 2 very different games, one based on Nemesis the Warlock and one based on everyone's favourite Berserker, Slain, or however you pronounce it. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it. How would you pronounce it?
We generally have a policy that it's Slain. Right. Just because I'm fairly sure somewhere there's a couple of rhyming couplets that don't work unless you say Slain. And all the puns about Slade and all that, they don't really work. But it's a bit Slania, something like that. Yeah. I'm not Irish, so I'm probably insulting quite a lot of people with that pronunciation. But yeah, we'll go with Slain for the purposes of this podcast.
Okay, fair enough. Right. Yeah. So they Creative Reality and Martech, they produce these 2 really interesting games that are quite well thought of these days. So although I said earlier about Rogue Trooper, I think this Rogue Trooper and Nemesis and Slain are certainly the most interesting of the 2000 AD 8-bit games. Nemesis was a 1-screen game where you had platforms and you had to basically kill. You played Nemesis and you had to kill all the various Terminators, and I assume eventually you ended up facing off against Torquemada. And it was notable for being able to pile up bodies, so you could get higher up the screen, which is quite macabre and quite suited, I think, to Nemesis the Warlock. And you could also spit as well, just like the real character. So, so I think that was probably quite popular with kids back then. And then with Slain, they tried something really different. They used a new technology called Reflex, which was like some sort of system they devised. And what they were trying to do, it was quite interesting what they were trying to do. They were basically trying to mimic what they thought the internal mind of Slain would be like. And obviously, as a Berserker, it's going to be fairly chaotic. So they had a system where there was basically a cloud and all these commands drifted in and out. So it would say like yes or no, and then it would be go south, or hit Ukko was a common one. So you'd have all these commands swanning in and out of this window, and if you wanted to progress in the game, you had to click on the right command at the right time. So as a representation of Slane's mind, it was probably quite accurate, especially as you usually ended up just hitting Ukko most of the time. But as a game, to be fair, it didn't really work. And it had lovely graphics. The display was beautiful and everything. Dave Dew did the graphics, and it looked really good. And for the first time, you had the characters on the screen and you could see them, and they looked lovely, and it really looked like them. But unfortunately, as a game, it took a bit of a backward step and was a bit too frustrating to play.
It's interesting that when you talk to the people who are developing these games, that they are fans of 2000 AD. Do you think that was important for them to be fans of this stuff, or do you think it may have been a hindrance? Because the way you just described the Slain game, that sounds almost as if they're in their desire to include lots of elements of the comic strip. It perhaps got in the way of the gameplay.
Well, yeah, I think that's a good point, and it also portrays the way that games were developed back in the 80s, because the creative reality team were basically left to themselves to develop the game.
Right.
And he said to me that they had, because I remember talking to him about Slain in particular, and said, look, this is crazy. You must have, it looks lovely, but you must have seen that it was going to be a really frustrating game. And he said, well, we didn't really think about it. We just wanted to produce something that was faithful to the comic strip. And I said, well, didn't you take it along to Marte? What did they think about it? Because I would have thought to myself, they'd say, oh, let's have a go on it, and think, oh, I can't really do what's going on. But he said, no, we took the game along, the demo of what we'd done, and they just looked at it and thought, yeah, that looks great. Just carry on. And then they just handed them the finished game when it was done, and that was what ended up on the shelves. So I think it does betray a little bit the creative process in the 80s. And while, yes, you can say, yeah, it was a bit of a mess, Slain, and Nemesis wasn't that great. It was just basically a one-screen thing, and they could have done a bit more. I think also what you've got to appreciate is the creativity and the fact that they did try and do something different. They failed, especially in the case of Slain, but they did try and do something different. And I think that it should be applauded for that, at least.
So was that it for the 8-bit games, or were there still other people who were developing stuff based on 2080 characters?
We've missed out a biggie, haven't we? I've mentioned him once. Old JD himself.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the most obvious character, really. I mean, not just for the fact that it's 2000 AD's flagship character, but he's a guy in a suit that goes around shooting perps. I mean, it's made for a video game. So yeah, there was a company called Melbourne House, which was an Australian software house. And in 1985, as early as 1985, this license was being developed, and it had a rather difficult genesis and development, and the game didn't end up appearing until 1986. So there were a lot of 2000 AD games appearing around this time, and they basically turned Dread into a bit of a dull platform game, and it didn't really work particularly well. And it ended up on the Amstrad, I think, certainly on the Spectrum and the Commodore 64. And the Commodore 64 version scored 13% in Zap magazine.
Wow.
Which, yeah, it got a particular slating. And I think, obviously, as you can imagine, part of the problem was it got delayed. I think a lot of people were looking forward to it so much, and it looked reasonable in screenshots. And then when it just turned up, they tried to include a few things like speech bubbles, and the lawgiver was there and so on. But basically, the game didn't really make any difference what you did. It was just about running around, not particularly easily or well, shooting the odd bad guy. And yeah, it was not particularly well received. And to be honest, it's not a great game. And then a few years later, Virgin which had a video games division at the time, had a stab at it as well. But it was 1990, and the 8-bits were really on the wane, or starting to wane. And Virgin themselves were okay, but they started to their development team started to struggle a little bit with these games, and in the end they ended up producing something which was remarkably similar to the previous Judge Dredd game, and just as poorly received, unfortunately. So yeah, Judge Dredd, it's been a bit better since. Obviously there's been a few decent Judge Dredd games since, but yeah, it wasn't the best time for Judge Dredd, the 80s, unfortunately. Not on the Spectrum and the Commodore 64.
There was something that came up in the conversation that we had with Tim, Chris, and Dan about expectation.
Yeah.
That particularly when you're talking about Dread, everyone's got an idea about their perfect Judge Dredd game.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of the time these days, it's, you know, we want GTA but with Dread. We want to be able to drive around on the Lawmaster. We want to be able to arrest people, and you start racking up the expectations, and no game can possibly fulfill them.
No.
Do you think that was one of the problems with this era of of games development that perhaps expectation and ambition outstripped the actual technology of the time?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I'll tell you what would make it worse as well. Quite often, I know this was quite common. I've spoken to other fans from the time, but we'd all have our go into town and buy our games, and on the way home, whether it would be on the bus, on the train, or in our mum and dad's cars, we'd open up the cassette case and we'd get out the instructions, and the instructions would always be lovingly written, and it would paint this wonderful story about this game you were about to play. So by the time you got home and loaded it up, you were literally so excited, especially for something like 2000 AD. You're looking at the cover, thinking that looks great. And then, yeah, you're absolutely right. The reality was never going to be the same, even allowing for judicious use of your imagination. It was never going to be the same, unfortunately. And that's what I think makes a lot of the modern games, such as Rogue Trooper, such a wonder to play for someone who's played these older games. Is you realise, yeah, this is what we wanted back then, but of course, we were never going to get that on a ZX Spectrum. You were never going to get cover mechanics and that sort of thing on a ZX Spectrum. So yeah, it was definitely a case of we made the best of what we could back at the time. But of course, we didn't really know any better, so it was what it was really.
I mean, this is a digression, but I have very fond memories of buying SimCity 2000 in a boxed edition, but it was wrapped in like the kind of, not cable ties, but that kind of fibrous anti-theft stuff, and basically ruining my teeth in the car on the drive home trying to chew it open so that I could get the instruction manual and see inside. I was very excited about that game. I mean, it also gives you an idea of just the kind of games that I like. We talked a lot about the limitations of these games and where they didn't necessarily go right. But again, in the conversation that we had the other week with the guys, what did they get right? As somebody who played them when he was young, what do you think was the benefit of having these? What were the elements that they got correct?
Well, certainly the games looked good. That's for sure, in terms of the cases and the cover art, because there may have been an exception that I'm missing, but I think from memory, each of them had official cover art from 2000 AD artists on the cover. Certainly the early Strontium Dogs games did. So in as far as getting the games off the shelf, the money out your pocket and back home, they did the job there, that's for sure. In terms of aesthetics in the games themselves, I think quite a few of them did the job pretty well. It's just they didn't always weld it particularly well into gameplay. I think if you take elements of one and merge it with another, maybe you'd end up with the perfect 2000 AD game. But I think, because we talked earlier about 2000 AD fans, whether they were the best people to develop 2000 AD games. I think they were, to a certain degree. But also the best people to develop games back then knew how games worked. The guys that people remember these days, your Andrew Braybooks, people like this on the Commodore 64, Steve Turner on the Spectrum, Rafael Secco on the Spectrum. They knew how games work. They knew how to make a good game. So I think if you'd have said to one of those guys, here's the 2000 AD strip, go and make a game based on it now, maybe we would have got something better, but maybe, and most probably, we wouldn't have got something that was quite evoking 2000 AD, the spirit of 2000 AD, as much as the games we did get do. So it's a bit of a hit and miss really as to what could have happened on that scale. I think, personally speaking, the 2000 AD games I played, I think they all did a fairly good job of making you believe that you were in the 2000 AD universe. Just some of them played a bit better than the others.
One group of people that we haven't talked about is the creators, the people who created these characters and were drawing them and writing them in 2000 AD. Was there any consultation between the people who were developing these games and the characters creators themselves?
Who is it that created Nemesis Thorlock?
Pat Mills and Kevin O'Neill.
That's it, yeah. When I interviewed Jazz Austin, he told me that he had a long conversation with Pat Mills on the phone. He was given his number by Martech. Presumably they got it when they were arranging the license. And they spoke a lot about the details of the character. Obviously, he was a huge fan of the strip. So I remember Jazz telling me that it was a huge honour to speak to Pat and be able to work out a few details and everything. But I think Pat probably didn't really know a lot about video games, and Jazz was kind of left on his own after that. But I think other than that, I believe that all the developers behind the games, they just had the comic strips to work on and had very little contact with, probably with 2000 AD, probably with the publishers, and probably with the creators as well of the comic strips. It was all done, they had the art and the stories to work on. But to be honest, that's a fairly rich, to draw on, isn't it?
Yeah.
Information to draw on, and I think that's really all they needed.
In terms of your interest, because you've written a couple of features about this relatively recently, why do you think it's important to remember these games and to kind of go over them and see what they got right and what they got wrong?
Well, I think games history is as valid history as anything else, and a lot of these people that developed games in the 80s, sadly, they're getting older, and I think these stories, I think it's important. Obviously, the video games industry is a huge industry today, and I think it's just like the movies or music. Its history can be as interesting as any game today. And I think it's important to look back and see where games went right and where they went wrong, and that can be used to basically work on games today and see how they can go right or wrong. Because essentially, the graphics do change, yes, of course they do, but the gameplay styles never really change. I always laugh at my sons playing Fortnite because all they're basically doing is running around shooting things. And when I was a kid, that's what I played on my Spectrum. The games looked drastically different, of course they did, but that was basically what you were doing. I was shooting aliens, he was shooting people, I suppose, or they're shooting people in Fortnite. So the gameplay never really changes. Little bits are added, and little bits are refined and changed. But yeah, I've always had a strong history in video games. Obviously, a big 2000 AD fan as well. So it seems to me it was an obvious thing to write about.
And do you think it's ironic that when 2000 AD, and people forget this because obviously it was quite anarchic, it was quite authoritarian. It was still being published, it was still owned by this multi-million-pound conglomerate of a publisher. But you had games which, as you've described, could often be quite an ad hoc operation, people at home just kind of tapping away and coding stuff. Do you think it's ironic that 2000 AD is now owned by a computer games firm?
Yes, yeah, it is, yeah. Very ironic. Yeah, it's almost like it's come full circle, really. Like it was started off as a comic and then games were made of the comic, and now, like you say, it's owned by a video games company. And I think when it first happened, I was really excited about it, expecting lots of 2000 AD games like a lot of people, and I think we're all like fingers crossed this will happen again soon, because it's still all the strips are still great properties in terms of video games, maybe apart from Ace Trucking Co or something like that. But
controversial.
But they're basically all no, I love the strip, but whether it would make a great game or not, is another matter. But there's so much rich material there for games, and I'd love to see. Something that I've always been fascinated by, we've already touched on it, was Judge Death. I love the Judge Death character and the whole Apocalypse storylines and everything. Were always my favourite Judge Dredd storylines. I think some sort of, and also I love horror video games, so some sort of game set based on that. I know we've already had Judge Dredd versus Judge Death, but I think some sort of like horror game, stealth type horror game would be right up my street, to be honest. So
I'll put it on the big stack of suggestions.
Yeah,
that have
in the suggestion box. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for that, Graham. That's been absolutely fascinating. Like I said before we start recording, I was a bit too young for the whole ZX Spectrum thing, so it's really interesting to hear about how that all developed. Where can people find you online if they want to talk more about 8-bit video games?
Well, I'm very busy on Twitter, wasting my time on there, and I'm at WizWords, and I've also got my own website, www.wizwords.net. And you can obviously also read my stuff on Eurogamer, and which is a very big gaming website, and Retro Gamer, which is the premier retro gaming monthly magazine.
Huge thanks to Graham for talking about 8-bit computer games. It wasn't really my thing at the time. I was more into, Lego and comics. Well, I was quite young. That's the last of the interviews for this episode of the Lockdown Tapes. We'll be back in 2 or 3 days, hopefully, with more from the 2000 AD thrillcast. We're going to have more creator interviews. We're going to be doing deep dives on specific characters and series with comic book critics and writers and all sorts. Lots of really great stuff. Keep your eyes peeled on our social media and on 2000ad.com for more to keep you occupied during your pandemic lockdown. And as I said last time, stay safe, look after yourselves, and until next time, Splundig the Thrig.
Alert! 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 Fill power levels dangerously high. Alert! Alert! Read 2000 AD every week. Ask your comic book store or newsagent now. Subscribe to the galaxy's greatest comic at 2000adonline.com.